this methodology literature started with intelligence, we have a tendency to think first of the ways in which cohort differences make us think that there are age differences when there are not age differences. But if the cohort effects go the other direction, and actually later born people are disadvantaged, cohort effects can actually hide real age differences, or at least underestimate them, because the earlier born people are actually better off in some ways. This actually tends to be true for a lot of depression and a lot of other mental disorder stuff, for example. It actually turns out is a major sort of cohort effect that cohorts born before World War II generally should, on several, actually most of the ones that we've studied, most mental disorders actually have a lower prevalence of mental disorder than later born cohorts. And for depression, there's actually a fairly systematic increase in prevalence and earlier age of onset in successive cohorts across a couple of decades.
Do you think that's really because people are just becoming more depressed, or is it just because there's been like a push towards recognizing it?
It's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. The better studies are actually based on clinical diagnosis, so it's not just self-reported reports. And in fact, we'll talk about this more, I hope, when we get that part of class, but one of the things that you really want to be cautious about in most of the Gero literature is that we have a tendency to base thinking about clinical disorders purely on self-reported inventories, many of which relate rather poorly to actual clinical diagnosis. And gerontology is just rife with those kinds of studies. But you're still obviously, for clinical diagnosis, too, in some sense you're relying on what people will tell you, although the actual judgment is somebody else's judgment, and you also have, to some extent, people are assessing behavior and nonverbal cues, and things other than just what people tell you. And some, do that whole lecture. I think there's probably a real effect of some kind there. Some of it may be due to greater willingness to report, but I think something happened, and people actually are experiencing more mental disorders in the post-World War II, post-middle of the 20th century era than before that. And like most cohort effects, we don't have real good ideas about the why. There's been a lot of speculation. I mean, people have said that maybe actually living in the shadow of nuclear warfare really does have some effect on things and stuff. Maybe it's urbanization, which kind of corresponds to that. Maybe it's higher crime rates and stuff, which also sort of correspond to that shift. Some people would argue that it's the changes in the family that kind of go along with urbanization and some of the other stuff. Before World War II, even in the U.S. and Western Europe, much more of society was small town to rural, and at least intact nuclear families to extended families were pretty common. And then after that, you get nuclear families, and then broken and blended nuclear families, and so forth. So there may be less support. I don't put decisive scientific weight on this, but if you talk with older people about that, they say, you guys get stressed out more because you let yourselves get stressed out. And I've come with, first I kind of was skeptical of that, but over the years, I think maybe they have a point. I just heard it so many times I started believing it. Longitudinal designs, very compelling, and of course, there is, how can you argue with the idea that if you want to know something about the aging process, what you ought to do is watch people get old. You really should. You do only sample one cohort, which is why you're not confounded then with cohort effects, because everybody in a simple longitudinal design is from the same cohort. If you've got different results in different longitudinal studies, those could be due to the longitudinal studies being from different cohorts. But longitudinal studies, simple longitudinal designs, could be confounding with time effects. If there's something that happens during the course of your study that might affect the variables of interest, then you might mistake a simple time effect for an aging effect, and you have to think about that. The biggest single problem with longitudinal studies is attrition. Anytime you do something where people have to come back, you lose some of them. And it gets worse the longer the time lapses are and so forth. And typically the attrition effects are pretty huge. It's always intriguing to me that you get these studies that you get the abstract online, so we've got like 2,500 people in the study, and then the actual analysis sample is like 200 or something. By the time you get out to wave 5 or 6, that's what you've got left. It's not always quite that bad, but it's not uncommon. Certainly like 20-25% attrition, and more than 50% is not all that unusual, actually. Sometimes it does come down to where your final analysis sample is more like 20%, 10% of the original total. And unfortunately, one of the key words in the last bullet point is non-random. Arguably, is an essential principle of statistical methods. If it was random, it wouldn't matter because it would average out. But it isn't random. Other things being equal, men drop out of samples more than women. Minorities drop out of samples more than white non-Hispanic people do. Upper income, upper educated people stay in samples longer than lower income, less educated people. People who are going to die, not only people die non-randomly, which is really inconsiderate. But also people who are going to die, who aren't dead yet, but are going to die years down the road, are more likely to drop out of samples. Sicker people drop out of samples, sometimes even before they're very sick or before they know that they're sick. Less intelligent people are more likely to drop out of the sample. So if you do a single sample, simple longitudinal design, what you'll notice over time is as people get older, they get more female, they get whiter, they're healthier, they get more intelligent, they get wealthier, and they're more educated. Some of these things could actually happen. So maybe not so much. And this catches some of the things I just said. Did I miss anything from memory? There's not. So pretty much always, well, at least frequently, usually, maybe I shouldn't say always, longitudinal studies probably underestimate detrimental age effects. And conversely, I suppose, could overestimate positive aging effects. So if in fact cohort effects were leading you to overestimate age effects, by looking at both, you might sort of bracket where the real age effects were. But of course, if the cohort effects go the other way, you could end up with both cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies that would lead to underestimation of age decrements, overestimation of age improvement. So longitudinal studies are probably better than cross-sectional designs, usually, but not